Eight o'clock comes. I'm begging, I'm pleading. My family is advocating for my wife. Still no scan. 9 o'clock comes. They say that they need to do a blood transfusion. And I ask and I'm begging again, do something. Where's this CT scan? I thought it was supposed to be performed stat hours ago. At which point the staff at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center tells me that your wife isn't a priority right now.
A man is begging the doctors inside one of the most expensive hospitals in California to save his wife's life, and they look him in the eye and say she is not a priority. His wife had been bleeding internally for hours. She never made it out of that hospital alive. Before we get into what happened inside those walls, you need to know who Kira Dixon Johnson actually was, because that context is everything here. Kira was born on June 23, 1977, and grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel like the world was bigger than they thought. This woman had earned her pilot's license, competed in car races, finished marathons, and went skydiving for the fun of it. She spoke 4 to 5 languages fluently, had lived in China, and by the time she was in her 30s, she was working on a PhD at Pepperdine University in Los Angeles while running her own hospitality consulting business at the same time.
Best way I can describe Kira is she was sunshine personified. We're talking about a woman that raced cars, that ran marathons. She spoke 5 languages fluently. She was a skydiver. She had her pilot's license. Everything she put her mind to, she did. Had this incredibly infectious energy. She walked into the
Her
room,
husband, Charles Johnson IV, comes from a family a lot of people recognize. His mother is Judge Glenda Hatchett, who you may know from the television court show called The Verdict with Judge Hatchett. Charles and Kira first met around 2004 at a birthday party in Atlanta, and after years of building something real together, they got married in 2015. By all accounts, these two were deeply happy and had big plans for what their family was going to look like. Their first son, Charles V, came into the world around 2014 through an emergency C-section after some complications during labor, but Kira recovered from that perfectly and had no lasting issues from it at all. The family eventually moved from Atlanta to Los Angeles, where Kira continued her studies and kept living at full speed. By early 2016, she was pregnant again, and throughout the entire pregnancy, both she and the baby were in excellent health, with no warning signs of any kind.
Throughout her entire pregnancy, once again, Kira was a rock star, and all signs pointed to both Kira being extremely healthy as well as the new baby Langston being extremely healthy as well.
Hey, Mommy.
Hi, Daddy.
Hey, Langston.
Hi.
5 minutes away.
At our doctor's recommendation, we went into Cedars-Sinai Hospital on April 12th of 2016 for what we expected to be a routine scheduled C-section.
Kira had already decided the baby's name was going to be Langston. She wanted 2 boys who would grow up side by side as best friends, and she was excited. So, on April 12, 2016, she and Charles walked through the doors of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles for a planned, scheduled C-section, not an emergency or anything unusual, just a procedure that was set up in advance at one of the most resourced hospitals in the state of California. Langston arrived at approximately 2:33 in the afternoon, perfectly healthy, 10 fingers and 10 toes. Charles has described that moment as feeling like everything they had ever talked about was finally real. The family was complete. But as he sat beside Kira in the recovery room, still soaking in that feeling, he looked down and noticed that the tube draining urine from her body had turned pink with blood. He called the nurses over right away, They came in and assessed her, and they ordered a series of tests, including a CT scan that was supposed to happen immediately. In medical language, they call that STAT, which just means right now, no waiting. That order was placed around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that CT scan never happened. Not at 5 o'clock when her blood test results came back showing her levels were dropping fast. Not at 6 o'clock when an ultrasound showed fluid building up in her abdomen. Not at 7 o'clock when she was shivering and increasingly sensitive to touch. By 5:24 in the afternoon, the catheter was already draining bright red blood, and the surgeon who performed the C-section, Dr. Arjong Naim, had already been told about it. An emergency CT scan was officially ordered at 6:44 in the evening, and still nobody came to take her for it.
4 o'clock comes. 5 o'clock comes, still no CT scan. 6 o'clock comes, they perform an ultrasound. They see that her abdomen is filling with fluid. Her blood work comes back. It shows that her blood levels are dropping. She's beginning to lose color. She's shivering uncontrollably. When they examine her, she's sensitive to the touch. So by 5:30, 6 o'clock, there were very clear signs that she was hemorrhaging internally significantly. 7 o'clock comes, still no CT scan. 8 o'clock comes. I'm begging, I'm pleading. My family is advocating for my wife. Still no
All of
scan.
this was happening, and Charles was right there, watching it unfold hour by hour, doing everything a person can do inside a hospital without a medical degree. He was talking to doctors, flagging nurses, pulling people aside, explaining what he was seeing. And the entire time, the hospital kept telling him things were being handled and to wait. Meanwhile, Kira, a woman who had jumped out of airplanes without flinching, was lying in that bed telling her husband she did not feel right. Here is where the story gets darker, because what happened to Kira was not just a medical accident. The evidence points to a series of decisions made over and over again across 10 hours that left a woman to bleed internally while her family begged for somebody to do something. The C-section that delivered Langston took only 17 minutes from start to finish, which is less than half the time a standard planned C-section is supposed to take. Lawsuits filed later would describe that speed as dangerously reckless for a non-emergency procedure. The central allegation in those cases is that Dr. Arjong Naim moved so fast that he failed to properly close the bladder flap during the surgery, which created a cut that became the source of all the internal bleeding that followed. And then, according to those same lawsuits, after completing the surgery, Dr. Naim left the hospital entirely, handing Kira's care off to resident physicians, meaning doctors still in training. So while Kira's abdomen was filling with blood from a wound left open during surgery, the man who created that wound had gone home. Charles stayed. He was at his side the whole night, and he has spoken openly about how much mental pressure that put on him, because he understood that as a black man in a hospital setting, raising his voice or losing his composure could have been used against his wife and made her situation worse. He's described walking a constant line between advocating loudly enough to be heard and staying calm enough to be dismissed. And still, at 9 o'clock that night, when he pulled a nurse aside and told her directly that his wife was not doing well and that he needed help, this is what she said back to him.
I pulled a nurse to the side at Cedars and I said, "Look, my wife isn't doing well. I need help." And the woman looked me right in my eyes and she said, "Sir, your wife just isn't a priority."
At 11:42 that night, 2 physicians finally came to Kira's bedside, performed an ultrasound, and found what medical records describe as an expanding hematoma with free fluid in the abdomen, which in plain language means she was actively bleeding inside her body and it was getting worse fast. Both of those physicians recommended immediate surgery. Dr. Naim, who had come back to the hospital by that point, reviewed the findings himself and chose what records describe as expectant management, meaning he wanted to continue watching and waiting rather than operating. He overruled the 2 doctors who said she needed to go to surgery right then. That is the detail that is hardest to sit with. 2 doctors looked at the same information Charles had been screaming about for hours and said she needs to go to surgery now, and the original surgeon said no, let's keep watching. It wasn't until after midnight, more than 10 hours after the first sign of internal bleeding appeared, that the hospital finally made the decision to take Kira into the operating room. Charles walked next to her bed as they wheeled her down the hallway, holding her hand and trying his hardest to keep it together. He said that Kira was one of the most fearless people he had ever known in his entire life, which is why what she said to him in that hallway hit so hard.
I'm holding her hand. I'm doing the best I can to just kind of reassure her that everything's going to be okay. And she says to me, she says, "Baby, I'm scared." I can't even really think of another time in all the years that I've known Kira that I've ever heard her vocally say that she was scared of anything. And as we're walking down this hallway towards the OR, one of the doctors says, "It's not a big deal. Sometimes these things happen. I'm gonna go back into the same incision I made earlier. I'm gonna find out what happened. I'm gonna fix it. And she'll be back in 15 minutes. And so we're walking down this corridor, and you finally get to this set of double doors where I just can't go anymore. And they wheeled Kira into the operating room, and those doors closed behind her. And that was the last time I saw my wife alive.
When the surgical team opened her up, they found approximately 3.5 liters of blood sitting in her abdomen from the bladder wound that had been bleeding for over 10 hours while her family begged the hospital to act. She went into cardiac arrest immediately on the table. Kira Dixon Johnson was pronounced dead at 2:22 in the morning on April 13, 2016. Langston was about 11 hours old. The official cause of death was hemorrhagic shock, meaning she bled to death internally after a cut from her C-section was left untreated for an entire night. And a former surgical technician who had been inside that operating room later gave a recorded statement about what she saw when they finally got Kira in there.
The case bolstered by this video deposition from Angelique Washington, a former surgical technician at Cedars-Sinai who was in Kira's operating room.
The room started to look like a murder scene, a crime scene. It started, blood everywhere. I knew
After Kira died, Charles did not go quiet. He went to war. In March 2017, he filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Dr. Arjong Naim, and other providers connected to Kira's care that night. The lawsuit laid out in detail the 17-minute surgery, the bladder wound that was never properly closed, the CT scan that was ordered and never done, the surgeon leaving the hospital after the procedure, the not a priority comment, the overruled surgery recommendation, and the 10+ hours Kira was left to bleed while her family pleaded at the nurses' station. Charles also filed a separate malpractice suit specifically against Dr. Naim, which settled for $1 million. The larger case against the hospital settled confidentially in 2022 with no public admission of wrongdoing from Cedars-Sinai. But what came out during the discovery process of that first lawsuit, which just means the part where both sides gather evidence before trial, changed the entire direction of what this case became. Charles and his legal team found records suggesting that Black women at Cedars-Sinai were routinely receiving slower and less urgent care than white patients in similar medical situations, with different response times and different levels of urgency applied to the same types of symptoms. That finding led directly to a second lawsuit. In May 2022, Charles filed a civil rights lawsuit against the hospital, arguing that racial bias inside Cedars-Sinai contributed to Kira's death, and that she would still be alive if she had been a white woman. That case also settled confidentially. As for Dr. Naeem, the California Medical Board placed him on 4 years of probation for gross negligence, and that decision covered not just Kira's case, but at least 5 other patient complaints against him involving internal bleeding after surgery. Charles testified before the medical board and told them directly that a probation sentence sent a message to the entire state that a doctor could cause a woman's death and face almost no real consequences for it. Dr. Naeem completed his probation and returned to practicing medicine.
But the truth is that she went in healthy. They botched it. She was butchered. The autopsy is very clear about that. And that she was allowed to hemorrhage, not for an hour or 2 hours, but for 10 hours before they got her back to the OR. She never left the recovery area, so they knew that something was wrong.
Then the federal government stepped in. In January 2025, the Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights reached an agreement with Cedars-Sinai requiring the hospital to put mandatory bias training in place, create new emergency protocols for hemorrhage cases, give patients access to doulas during labor and delivery, build an anonymous system for reporting bias, and publish public reports on what they find annually. The agreement ran for 3 years and was the first of its kind involving a federal civil rights investigation into how a hospital treats Black women during childbirth.
I am insulted, frankly, that Cedars put out this statement. We're concerned. Well, what have you done? Well, we've given $2.2 million to different organizations. That is minuscule. It's not enough, and it hasn't been systemic change. But now that HHS has opened this investigation, it will not just mean that Cedars-Sinai will have to be held accountable, but hospitals all over the
Now
country.
here is the part that should make you stop and really think, because this is bigger than one hospital in California. Kira Johnson was not poor or uninsured. She spoke multiple languages, a PhD in progress, a pilot's license, and a family physically standing in that hospital all night long fighting for her. Her mother-in-law was a former judge. Her husband never left her side, and none of that moved the needle. The hospital still let her bleed for 10 hours and told her husband she was not worth the urgency. Which brings us to Dr. Shalon Irving, because what happened to Kira was not a one-time accident at one hospital. Shalon was a scientist at the Centers for Public Health Prevention, the United States government agency that tracks public health threats across the entire country. She had spent her entire career studying the gap in healthcare between Black patients and everyone else. In January 2017, 9 months after Kira died, Shalon gave birth to her daughter and was sent home a few days later. She kept going back to her doctors over the next 3 weeks because her blood pressure was dangerously high and something felt wrong, but her concerns were not taken seriously, even though she was a trained scientist describing her own symptoms in precise medical terms. She collapsed at home from cardiac arrest 3 weeks after delivery and did not survive. A woman who literally worked for the government agency that is supposed to catch these crises, who had spent her entire career trying to close this exact gap, was killed by it because nobody listened to her either. Black women in the United States are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. And that number doesn't care how much money you have or how educated you are. Charles showed us that every single hour of that night. Charles founded For Kira for Moms in 2017 and has spent every year since then in hospital boardrooms, state capitals, and congressional offices pushing for real change. His work helped get the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act passed in December 2018, the first significant federal law in decades aimed at the maternal death crisis in America. He also pushed for the Cura-Johnson Act, which is part of a larger piece of legislation called the Black Maternal Health Omnibus, and it directs money toward community organizations working to close the gap in care for Black mothers specifically.
And so that's why we are here, because this is there's nothing that I can do to bring Kira back. There's nothing that I can do, but what I can do, and the highest honor and tribute that I can pay to my wife, is to fight as hard as I possibly can, whenever I can, to make sure that we send mothers home with their babies.
If there is a Black woman in your life who is pregnant right now, share this video with her. Not to put fear in her, but because knowing what to watch out for is how you protect yourself when the system will not do it for you. And if this story hits you the way it hits me every time I go through it, tap the card on your screen right now, because the next video we have for you connects directly to everything you just watched. We'll see you there.